going to preach in the 20th chapter of Acts, and I'm going to talk to you about a disease. It's a horrible disease. It's a deadly disease. And it's not in our church, but I know some churches that are having to deal with this on a regular basis. And the disease is called Infectious Euticanitus. You may not have ever heard of this disease, but if not, you'll hear from it here in a few minutes, okay? Infectious Euticanitus. And it's more deadly than any of the other diseases we've ever had to deal with. And so I just wanted you to, and by the way, like a lot of these other diseases we've been dealing with, it gets blamed on the wrong person. And you'll see that as we go through this as well. Another part of this sermon, though, as we're dealing with infectious Euticanitis, we're going to also see the journeys that Paul has in this third mission journey, the journeys and how adaptive they are. He's been in several years now in this same region, and here we are in the 20th chapter, and he's about to leave the region, but the way that he leaves is very important and very impressive. So, Acts chapter 20, verse 1. After the uproar had ceased, Paul just come through the problems at Ephesus. After the uproar had ceased, Paul called the disciples to himself, embraced them, and departed to go to Macedonia. So he's going to Macedonia. He's been there before, but now he's going to touch the place in a new way. Verse 2, now when they had gone over that region and encouraged them with many words, he came to Greece. So he's several months through Macedonia. Now he comes to Greece and stayed there 3 months. And when the Jews plotted against him as he was about to sail to Syria, he decided to return through Macedonia. So instead of sailing, he put some of his team on a sailboat, but he and a handful of other team members decided to go by land and make it to Macedonia. Verse 4, and Sopater of Berea, that's a politician, a friend, Sopater, accompanied him to Asia. Also Aristarchus and Secundus of the Thessalonians, and Gaius and Derbe, and Timothy, and Tychicus, and Trophimus of Asia. Now these are fairly new, not all of them, most of them are fairly new associates. They have really enjoyed his time at Ephesus and other places, and they are traveling with him just to get more out of him. You know, when you're walking and you're only covering 7 to 10 miles a day, and you have to go 50 miles, the journey itself can become a teaching experience. That's what Jesus did. Jesus did not use the synagogue method of teaching. He used the Greek method of teaching, which is to teach as you walk around. So the classroom is always mobile whenever you teach that way. And Jesus he was the Hebrew of Hebrews now, but he chose, because he was going to be on the run, he chose to constantly teach his men as they were traveling. I've always thought it's been a mistake for colleges to locate, especially Christian schools, to locate in large metropolitan areas because they are covered with cement. And I often thought, wouldn't it be great if somebody started a University of Jesus that actually taught the way that Jesus taught? To walk from here to there and teach as you go. To intentionally go by a lake or a river and use the atmosphere of that for part of your lesson that day. And to be able to be where you can actually interact with people as you're demonstrating to your students whatever lesson you had for the day. That would be an interesting school. We call it life, you know. And that's the kind of school that you and I are in. We should minister as we are walking through our day. We are to share Jesus. We are to talk and encourage Christians. It's the University of Jesus everywhere we go every day. And that's what they were taking advantage of here on this journey, no doubt, pumping Paul for as much information as they possibly could before he had to leave them. Verse 5, these men going ahead, waited for us at Troas. But we sailed away from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread, and in 5 days joined them at Troas, where we stayed 7 days. Now on the first day of the week, when the disciples came together to break bread, Paul, ready to depart the next day, spoke to them and continued his message until midnight. So let's get all this teaching we can out of Paul. He's leaving the next day. Let's just have him teach all night long. Now, I think that's a good use of stewardship there. Last time you're going to see your best scholar, let's just get every ounce of knowledge out of him we possibly can. We've already watched him as he walks and talks for days, but now we're going to visit with him and fellowship, and no doubt they had some food together, and they were just going to do that. Several points I want to point out about this as we deal with some of these things. First of all, I want you to see that this is the first mention in the Bible, chronologically anyway, of doing worship on the first day of the week. Now, the church would meet on the first day of the week, but in many instances in the book of Acts and other places. But Jesus, kind of got that started. But you have, as well, you have the Old Testament teaching that you worship on Saturday. So what the early church was doing is they would go to the synagogue on Saturday. That was the traditional Hebrew worship time, and they just participated in that. It both helped them understand the Old Testament. It helped them to have an opportunity to interact with other people who believed in monotheism and believed the Old Testament. It allowed them to be a witness to those people and to discuss with them the life of Christ and the teachings that were coming out of this new generation of believers we call New Testament saints. And so that going to the synagogue made sense. Going on Saturday made sense, but they would also many times gather on Sundays at the edge of town to do their baptisms. And there was always at the edge of a town, there would be a stream or a river, and that's where they would gather. People would be coming and going, getting water for the day. They didn't have a lot of centralized piping like we have, and so they had to go get their water, and they would be able to talk to people, and they would have times of preaching and all of that. But they were still primarily identifying in many instances with Saturday as a key time just for worship and for Bible study. Well, here we have an instance where they are doing their worship on the first day of the week, and then whenever you get to 1 Corinthians 16:2, you find that that's the pattern that the Apostle Paul sets out, is that they should worship and take the supper and things of that nature on the first day of the week. So people will ask you, why don't we worship on Saturday? Well, we can worship on Saturday. Saturday in the Old Testament was supposed to be a day of rest and worship. Now, I personally enjoy Saturdays, and it's not always a day of rest. I've already begun the process of using the weekend to mow the weeds in my yard. I wouldn't have to mow the grass by now, but the weeds get tall pretty quick, and so I have to mow the onions and other weeds that I have in my yard. And technically, Old Testament-wise, that would be a no-no. You know, you're not supposed to do physical labor and things of that nature. You're supposed to focus on the Lord. And I think the principle of that continues to be, we have in the New Testament an emphasis on all of the Ten Commandments except that one. To remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy is not doubled down on in the New Testament. But it is that we can see what their patterns were in worshiping on the first day of the week, because that was the day of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And that's where the church was gathered together in obedience to him, waiting for him to appear in their midst, which he did. And then every one of the appearances of Jesus Christ was on a Sunday. There were at least 11 appearances over a period of 40 days, and every one of them was on a Sunday. And so that is why we made the jump. And the teachings later, like in 1 Corinthians of the Apostle Paul, that's why we believe that the believers that are both Jew and Gentile have as their emphasis the first day of the week, which is Sunday. Now, the Bible teaches on the seventh day God rested. That's Old Testament. But now the resurrection of a new day, of a born-again experience, and of the future chronology of the Lord and how things work in heaven is on the first day of a week, emphasizing not just the resurrection of Jesus, but the coming resurrection of all, of a new heavens and a new earth is represented by the first day of the week. That beginning day of creation, when God had it in the Old Testament, that's going to be the beginning day of the new creation as well, based upon the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So if people ask you, why do you worship on Sunday instead of Sabbath day, instead of Saturday? It's because of the pattern of the New Testament, the pattern of the resurrection of Jesus. And that all fits into what makes us New Testament Christians, okay? So on the first day of the week, verse 7, the disciples came together to break bread. That is a reference to the Lord's Supper. Paul, ready to depart the next day, spoke to them and continued his message until midnight. Now, don't get excited. Okay, we're following the pattern here. If we follow the pattern, I should preach till midnight. But I'm not going to do that. I guarantee you there's enough preachers in the room, we could do a tag team and it'd be all day long. It'd be a lot of fun. We'd have to take a couple of breaks for you women to do some sandwiches or something, but we could do this. We may do this someday, just to reenact this pattern, if you will, in the New Testament. But they were taking advantage of Paul's last day with them to get as much training out of him as they possibly could. Verse 8, there were many lamps in this upper room where they were gathered together, and in a window sat a certain young man named Eutychus, who was sinking into a deep sleep, as young men are prone to do at church. None of ours will do that, but some will do that. He was overcome by sleep, and as Paul continued speaking, he fell down from the third story and was taken up dead. It killed him. He fell from the third story and fell out of the window at midnight because he was asleep. Now, sleeping in church, since then, I have called Infectious Euticanitus. You have the disease of Eutychus. And I've always told my people, I'll tell you freshly again for those that are new, it's okay if you sleep in church until you snore. And then we are going to give you a sharp elbow in the gut and see if that helps you to stay awake for the rest of the sermon. Is that okay? Okay, I think that's a good rule. It's all right. It's better if you don't go to sleep. If you do go to sleep, it could be from one of two reasons. It's either you're tired or I'm not active enough in the pulpit to keep you awake. So the reason I walk around, the reason I change my voice level is really just to keep you from having a problem with dying in church of infectious Euticanitis. But I think this disease has swept the country in many churches. I think this disease is very real out there, and it's my job and other preachers' job to try to make sure that that it's not going to be a permanent problem. We need to wake them up by the strength of our preaching. But then verse 10 gives us a wonderful angle on this. But Paul went down, fell on him, and embracing him said, "Do not trouble yourselves, for his life is still in him." Now when he had come up and broken bread and eaten and talked for a long while, even till daybreak, he then departed. So what he did was raise him from the dead. He was able to pray and be able to say, basically, Lord, use some of my life to bring him back to life. And by doing that, and because he's an apostle, and because God authenticates his word through miracles when it's being produced in the first century, God gave him this miracle of raising this young man from the dead. And people say, well, that's what happens. You go to church and preacher preaches too long, people die, And, it's a preacher's fault. And this is a good example of that. The preacher preached too long, and he said, wait. Read the rest of the text. Verse 12, and they brought the young man in alive. And that was after, it says, he talked in verse 11, until daybreak. So we went back up and preached till 6 or 7 a.m. He went another 6 hours after he raised Eutychus from the dead. So that's proof that there was no sin in Paul's character for going too long preaching in church. He had basically preached for 12 hours or more. And everybody was happy, but they just let it get a little bit too many fumes from the lanterns in there, and the end result was a teenage boy that hadn't gotten enough sleep the night before, playing video games and stuff, and sleeping in church, and I think it should comfort every teenage boy here that we're going to take care of you if you fall dead in church. We're going to try to raise you up from the dead, and then we're going to preach another 6 hours, okay? Look at verse 13. Then he went ahead to the ship and sailed to Assos, there intending to take Paul on board, for so he had given orders, intending himself to go on foot. Now, let me just make another observation, if I can, here. Luke is now part of the journey because he uses the pronoun we. We got on the boat. We made this trip. When it says we, it means Luke, the author of Acts, is with them, or with the Apostle Paul at that time. I'm going to go over those real quick with you. In chapter 16:10 through 16:18, Luke is with them at Troas on the way to Philippi. That was in 49 A.D. This gives you an idea how many years are passing as you go through the book of Acts. In chapter 20 here, from verse 4 through verse 19, he is with them from Philippi to Jerusalem. And this was somewhere between 54 and 57 A.D. that's taking place. What we're seeing right now is somewhere in the mid-50s A.D. All right? So that's what's happening, and Luke is with them for this almost a chapter here, from chapter 20, verse 4 to 21:19. And then from chapter 27 to the end of the book, 28:31, from chapter 27:1 through 28, the end of the book, Luke is with them at Caesarea until they get to Rome for Paul's imprisonment. And so he is with them much of the time in the second half of the book of Acts. So isn't it great that the guy that wrote the Gospel of Luke and the guy that wrote the Acts of the Apostles was actually interacting with it, several probably, but especially one of the apostles, Paul, and able to spend, he heard those 12 hours of teaching when Eutychus fell out of the window. He heard that. He got that from Paul. He understood Paul's theology, and he also, of course, understood, because of other interviews he did as a physician historian, he understood the teachings of Jesus that had come through John and Peter and the other apostles. And he was able now to write for us the Gospel of Luke. He was able to write for us and put down for us the Gospel of Luke as well as the book of Acts. Not only that, but I believe, and one of my best friends in the earth did his doctoral dissertation on this and published a book about it, and because of the vocabulary, it is probable that Paul the apostle did not write the book of Hebrews, There's no claim of that other than a few historical references a few hundred years after him. But the problem with Paul writing Hebrews is that the writer of Hebrews didn't have the same vocabulary as Paul in his other writings. He didn't have the same knowledge that Paul had. When Paul would say, it says something in the Old Testament, he would actually cite, like if it was Isaiah or if it was one of the other writers of the Old Testament. But the writer of Hebrews several times says, and it says somewhere in the Old Testament. You know what I mean? He couldn't quote chapter and verse. So he didn't have Paul's knowledge. And his phrases were wrong. His vocabulary was wrong. Well, when you plug in the phraseology and the vocabulary and you compare it to other authors, the only match that makes sense is Luke. So the Lucan authorship of Hebrews would mean that Luke wrote almost as much of the Bible as anybody else. That's how important it is that we understand a little bit about who Luke is and how God used him in a special way. And so I just wanted to throw that in there because Luke is part of the flow of the book of Acts. He not only wrote it from the accounts that he got from Paul and others, but he also wrote the book of Acts because of his own experience in traveling and listening to and watching what was going on here in the book of Acts. Isn't that good? That's just good stuff to know. Verse 13. And then we went ahead to the ship and sailed to Assos, there intending to take Paul on board, for so he had given orders, intending himself to go on foot. And when he met us at Assos, we took him on board and came to Mytilene. We sailed from there, and the next day came opposite Chios. The following day we arrived at Samos and stayed at Trogyllium. The next day we came to Miletus. Now all of this is telling us one thing. Paul is traveling places he hadn't been in a long time or places he had never been, and most likely he was doing it for two reasons. One, they were after him, and he wanted to stay out of the normal traffic lanes. He didn't want them to catch him and arrest him. Secondly, he's able to touch lives he hadn't touched before because he's going in different directions. That's the way we have to look at our lives. You know, sometimes the Lord lets you change direction. Sometimes he makes you stay put. Sometimes you want to stay put. He makes you change direction. It's all meant to work in such a way that you become stronger in your faith and that you have the opportunity to be around people that need to hear who you are and who Christ is. And so, understanding that, we need to be as flexible as the Apostle Paul. We need to realize that there are times when he was having great success in ministry, but he also had a lot of times when he was beaten, when he was stoned, when he was thrown in jail. And it's all because he was flexible, moment by moment by moment, to following the leadership of the Lord as best he knew it, and to stay one step ahead of the devil. And that's really the reason we need to be open day by day and hour by hour to what God is doing in our lives. Because, folks, the Lord is always active in your life. And the devil is always active to undo you. And so if you're stuck in a rut and you're doing things the same way, you're an easy target for Satan. In fact, if you're stuck in a rut, you know what he's going to do? He's going to leave you alone. He's got you right where he wants you. Stuck in a routine that doesn't involve faith and change. So be aware of that. It's okay to have to go a different route. It's okay to have to deal with a different group of people. It's okay if I get shook up a little out of my routine, because God's using that to take my witness and spread it to people that I don't normally see. So be aware of that. While we see it as a disruptive thing, it's not always disruptive. It's sometimes part of the success we can have in ministry because God's unexpectedly moving us around. And that could be from moving from one floor to another in an office building, or it could be moving from one part of town to another, or it could be moving from one nation to another. But whatever it is, Satan's going to try to pick you off, and God's going to try to use it for good. So be aware, change is not your enemy. Change in the wrong direction is your enemy. But change in the direction that Christ wants you to go is always going to end up with Him getting more glory and you getting more understanding of what God can do through you. And it's amazing what He can do through you. Verse 16, for Paul had decided to sail past Ephesus. He wasn't going to stop in Ephesus, spent years there, but they're after him. So he decided to sail past Ephesus so that he would not have to spend time in Asia, for he was hurrying to be at Jerusalem, if possible, on the day of Pentecost. So once again, he's trying to end a missionary journey in time to celebrate one of the feasts at Jerusalem. And this one would be at Pentecost, where he could revisit with his friend Peter, where he could relaunch again from there. And God had already revealed to him that he was going to be going from there unto another place. He was going to be going from there all the way to Rome. And so he didn't know at the time, but he found out later that he would get a free trip to Rome courtesy of Caesar. Isn't that great? Because he would be arrested. And because he was falsely accused and arrested the way he was, in order to save his own life, he would appeal as a citizen of Rome to Rome, and that would allow him to live long enough to be taken to Rome for judgment. Most of the people didn't know it, but Paul was a citizen of Rome, which gave him special privileges. So you're getting the understanding of who this guy is? Much of the book of Acts is about Paul. Because of his friendship with Luke, no doubt. But much of the book of Acts is about Paul. Now, there's so much more that was going on. Andrew was up around what we call Ukraine today. You know what I mean? Others were going to Spain, some across North Africa, some were making a difference like Thomas in India. So they all had their Paul-like stories, but we get Paul because of the affiliation with Luke and because the Holy Spirit chose for us to see how Paul's missionary journeys laid out. And what we need to get out of the book of Acts is not that this is all we need to know about the first century spread of the gospel. What we need to get out of the book of Acts is, what does it take for us to be effective today the way they were in the first century? What are the traits? What are the techniques? What is the strategy that allows us to be what we need to be? A lot of what we've decided to do as a church, what we've decided to do as a missions organization, a lot of what we've done is based upon the principles of what we can learn, and there's still so much we are learning from the book of Acts on how we can reach the world with the gospel of Jesus Christ. It's an amazing moment in time for us to put these things to work and watch them as God does great things. And sometimes, just like Paul, sometimes it's like 3 steps forward and 4 steps backwards. All of a sudden, oh man, I was able to see all these people changed at Athens. I was able to see all this great turnout at Ephesus. And then all of a sudden, I'm beaten and then I'm thrown in jail. And that looks like you're going backwards, but you're not. You know, God wanted Paul to write some letters. And he needed the time. He couldn't keep preaching 12-hour sermons and write the book of Romans. So God had to give him some downtime. And that's what the arrests of Paul and the imprisonments and jail time of Paul were all about. God was giving him some jail time so that he could conquer Rome writing letters from prison. Isn't that great? I think that's awesome. I think it's not the first time, it was the first time, but not the last time that somebody would be thrown in jail so that God could get them to write something that he could use to stir up the Christian world. That's happened several times with several authors. So sometimes the one thing we can do that we don't put into our schedule is, how can we get better at using our downtime? to do those things we've been wanting to get around to that are good for the gospel, you have them. If not, you're going to. You're gonna work. Some of you guys out there and girls, I know you're working 2 jobs and you're juggling everything, and it's not helping anything that all of a sudden gas is $7 a gallon some places, and you're trying to make ends meet, and our government seems to make it worse. Here's the government's way of fixing everything is to print more money, and all that does is tax you from a different direction. The printing of money with nothing behind it is nothing more than a tax. And now they say, oh man, the great news is that that unemployment's down. Yeah, people are having to work harder and 2 jobs and everything else just to survive because of what the government's done to us. And what we need to realize is Satan's ability to keep us too busy is actually going to hurt us. We're made to rest one day in 7. And we're made to stop and look and see how we can serve God better every now and then. And not just keep doing the same things. I'm not saying quit anything. But in order to do something new, you need some time. And God gave Paul some time by putting him in jail. And he still got to visit with a few people because he was a Roman and he was in jail. He could have visitors. And so people would come and visit him, and they would tell him what's going on in the different churches, and he would write letters to those churches. Corinthians had to have 4 letters. They were so messed up, But they were in a very secular world, living on the edge of a very secular time. It was the Hollywood of its day. And so he had to write all these letters. He said, well, how come there's only 2 letters in the New Testament? Well, in those 2 letters, it refers to 2 other letters. In fact, if I remember right, 1 Corinthians is really 2 Corinthians, and 2 Corinthians is really 4 Corinthians, something like that, But he references those other letters that he wrote them, but the only 2 that got included in the canon of Scripture that we have are those that seem to fit the application of the whole New Testament that would be what the Holy Spirit would endorse. So we have these letters that Paul wrote for different churches, different occasions, and he wrote those letters, including the best one of all, Romans. Romans gives us the theology that we need to always have. Romans. Now, 5 chapters are given, basically 3 at least, but parts of 2 others, just to talking about the doctrine of sin in Romans. I think it's pretty serious when God spends that many chapters just to talk about sin. Sin's a problem. And who did he write this? He was writing this thing so we would see our need to be saved from sin. But then he talks about, oh, wretched man that I am, who shall relieve me from the body of this death? And the whole idea there is he's still wrestling with sin. This is the greatest Christian on the planet, and he said, I'm the chief of sinners. And so we have that example in the book of Acts of Paul and what all he did and how he accomplished it, and you put that together with what he wrote in his letters and the doctrinal power of it all, and you say, how could one man impact the world like that? Well, he just went from place to place, day by day, as the Lord led him, and he didn't count being punished, he didn't count being beaten, he didn't count being jailed as something to keep him from continuing to serve the Lord. Now, here's what Satan will do. He'll take a loss in your life. Loss of a career, loss of a job, loss of a friend, loss of a loved one, a divorce. He'll take a wreck. He'll take a problem that you might have, whatever it might be. Satan will take that, and he'll convince you that because of that bad situation, you should withdraw from serving the Lord. You should back up. You should give up, or at least say, I'm going to take a couple of years vacation because I'm going to punish God for doing this to me. And that's the exact opposite of what Paul would do. He would say, you know what? They beat me. Now I know how Jesus felt a little bit. And it would produce his theology. and his love of the Lord by realizing that I'm not worthy to suffer as my Lord was suffering. And yet I've been counted worthy. And for that, it bred humility. He didn't get mad at God. He became humble because he realized he was counted worthy to suffer with Christ. So if you're suffering today, if you're hurting, if you're some of your family that's just totally miserable, I want you to know that there's two ways of looking at that. You can go inward and be down and depressed and griping at God or withholding your presence from the Lord, or you can say, no, I have been counted worthy to suffer, and I want to look into this whole thing and see what is it God's trying to do in my life. There's a reason for suffering. God never lets one drop of blood go to waste. It all counts. It all is there. Now, Satan's plan in your suffering is to make you bitter. His plan is to get you to blame God or just say, I don't understand it, and go into withdrawal. Because he knows the potential you have. And if you're hurting today, if you've lost a loved one, if you've lost a friend, if you're suffering with an ailment, it doesn't matter what it is. You got a knot-headed boss. Whatever it is that you're going through, you have to choose as a Christian to see what God's doing through it. He may not have caused it. He allowed it. And if he allowed it and didn't cause it, then you know that there's a reason you're going through that valley. Find the reason, and you'll find the victory. But if you don't look for it, you won't find it. Paul had to look for it. And going to jail or being beaten or having to take a different route to get around the military that was trying to arrest him, whatever that was that inconvenienced him, he saw it as an opportunity. He saw it as an opportunity. You know, because I'm going this route, I'm getting to train people I had never been able to train before. And because I went that route, I was able to have this. Well, this boy fell out of the window. He's dead. What are we going to do? I'm going to raise him from the dead, and we're going to finish preaching. What we had done, we had called off the meeting. We had made funeral arrangements. We hadn't even thought about raising him from the dead. So I really believe God has a plan for every negative thing that happens to us. He doesn't cause it, but he allows it. So I don't blame him because he's not the cause, but he allows it, and if he allows it, it's for my good and for his glory. So I need to look for it. What is in that will help me to be what he wants me to be? And listen, here's the good news. When you learn how to get victory in the middle of setbacks and problems and health and death and all of that, when you learn to get victory from that, to learn from it. Now, I don't mean victory it's not going to make you happy, but at least you'll find purpose in it. And finding that purpose will keep you from being bitter at God and make the heavens open to you every time you pray. It'll make you stronger in your faith. It'll give you a better witness. It'll help you to see that God hasn't taken his hand off of you, but the adversity is God putting his hand on you. There has no temptation that has come upon us, but such as is common to man. And God is faithful, who will, with the temptation, make the way of escape, that you may be able to bear it. Okay? We're living in a time where we have become too overly controlling of our own lives. We can control everything. We can control what goes into our mind by playing this video game or watching a TV set. We can control the atmosphere. When I was a boy, this is how old I am, 100 years ago when I was a boy, we didn't have this thing called air conditioning. And I and my brother shared a room upstairs. And what does that mean? All the heat from the downstairs goes to the upstairs. We had 2 windows about this tall and this wide that rolled out. We would roll those things as far as we could out. And I remember the joy in my life when we could afford a little box fan to set in the room to stir the air around upstairs. Woo-hoo, that was good, you know. Now listen, I could have been bitter, but I was grateful for that box fan. 115 degrees in Texas on a July day, and you're ready for a box fan. I have literally laid on my back at midnight in my room and looked down at my chest, and that little hole right there in the middle of your chest was full of water, sweat. You know what I mean? So what is it? Why is God so cruel to put me through stuff like that? Why is He so cruel to put you through stuff like that? You say, well, the devil caused it, but God allowed it, so I'm going to be mad at both of them. God is working all things to good to those who love Him and who are the called according to His purposes. He knew how to prepare me for the pastorate. Gets pretty hot there too. There's a little bit of sweat there too. I don't see it when I'm, a 10-year-old boy, but I see it now why God put me through that. It was preparation for what He was going to do with me. Now, I didn't get bitter about it. You know why? Because hardly anybody in town had air conditioning. We didn't play the comparison game, that kind of thing. But I want you to know, like the apostle, like Luke, like these others, everything that's happening around you is with purpose. It's not that you're just here and you're one of the millions and you're not important. You are vastly important to the Lord. He will relate to you as though you were the only person on the planet. He has a plan for you that's for nobody else. He wants to use you for His glory, and you may not even see how He used you for His glory until you get to heaven. But the one thing that Satan will use to derail you is to give you adversity and make you withdraw from action of serving the Lord because you don't understand Him or you're bitter about the loss, and so you withdraw, and that's where Satan wants you, on the sidelines. Yea, though I walk through the valley of death, I will fear no evil, for Thou art with me. Thy rod and Thy staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. Why did He go through the valley first and then He fought His enemies second? Because the valley prepared Him for the war. The valley prepared Him for the war. And then was the banquet table. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. The day will come, if you take that adversity correctly and you win the battle, that your enemies will have to watch you have a feast in the presence of the Lord, a victory feast, because you kept going through the valley. Satan wants you to stop in the valley. Don't let him go through the valley.